history of Mahoning County is amazing. Welcome, folks, to a show we called Locally Speaking. What we're going to try and accomplish here is to enlighten everybody in Mahoning County about Mahoning County, all the jurisdictions, all the little townships, the cities, the municipalities. We're going to learn about the past, the present, and the future of each one. We're going to try and enlighten you on it. It's not going to be a political show by any stretch. What we're going to try and do is just learn about our heritage. How did we all get to live in Youngstown or Poland or Canfield or Austintown or Boardman or anywhere in Mahoning County? How did it all come to be? That's what this first episode is going to be about. We're going to be talking to Bill Lawson. He's a local historian, and the knowledge that he has on Mahoning County is absolutely amazing. You're going to learn everything on how it was all settled. We were just at one point, if you could imagine this, if you walked into the woods somewhere and you saw a stream and a bunch of trees, that's what was here in Ohio. Until somebody had the vision to go west. Believe that. We were as west as they knew at one point in history. And they came here and they settled. And they came, when they tried to settle it, they surveyed it in little 5 by 5 mile plots. It's an amazing, amazing history that we have here in Mahoning County, and you're going to learn all about it. So our first episode of Locally Speaking is going to be featuring a great interview with Bill Lawson, and it's going to be coming up right now. So sit back and enjoy the history of Mahoning County. And then we hope you turn in every month, because we're going to be talking about all the areas, Austintown, which will be our first one that we're going to feature, Poland, Boardman, Canfield, every little township, every little municipality here in Mahoning County. And again, you'll learn about their past, their present, and where the vision for the future of our area, the area that we all love and live in, Mahoning County. Sit back and enjoy this, our first episode of Locally Speaking. Welcome back to Locally Speaking. I'm here with the Executive Director of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, Mr. Bill Lawson. Bill, thanks for spending the afternoon with us and enlightening everybody about where we came from and how we got here and the whole
my pleasure.
Its structure. Now, where exactly are you from? Are you from the Youngstown area?
Yes, I was born here in Youngstown, grew up Boardman Township, and except for a year and a half when I went away to school, I've lived here almost my entire life.
And how did you get involved in the Historical Society?
When I was a senior undergraduate at Youngstown State University, where I finished my college, I took a course called Introduction to Museum Practices, and it was taught by Dr. Luzona, who's the director of the Butler Institute of American Art. And at that time, along with the weekly classroom session, we also had to do a 5-hour practicum, and we could choose between working as an intern at the Butler or at the Armstrong Museum. And so in the winter of 1986, I had the opportunity to first see the inside of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society and the Armstrong Museum, and I loved it. And then after I graduated, I came back and volunteered, and I've been here ever since.
So at that particular time, the knowledge that you had about Mahoning County and the greater Mahoning Valley, Youngstown area, were you a historian at that point, or from that point on you became immersed in it?
Well, I majored in history, got a bachelor's and then a master's degree in history from YSU, and a lot of my research and writing that I did through my undergraduate and graduate work did have local topics, so that really helped me not only to get into public history with working for the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, but to better understand what's been going on in this region for a couple of centuries now.
Couple of centuries.
Yes.
It's amazing when you say that. It just a long time ago, it didn't seem that far, because we were talking 140 years. Now I'm 61, and now it's a couple centuries, and it's flies by quick. So let's talk about Mahoning County and the greater Mahoning County area. How did it all start? What brought people here? And go ahead, buddy. You're the historian.
Well, you have to understand something. In the late 18th century, this was after the Revolution, this was after the adoption of the Constitution of the United States. You had the first 13 states, which grew out of the English colonies here in North America. But even at that time, as the populations grew, people were looking westward. Even before the Revolution, the colonies were looking westward in terms of future expansion. And this part of Ohio, Northeast Ohio, in particular, has a strong connection to the colony and then state of Connecticut, because this was part of the state of Connecticut's land claim that they maintained in the late 18th century for use of expansion of their citizens. And actually, the state of Connecticut and the United States did not settle that land claim, and which officially made northeastern Ohio part of the United States in general in the state of Ohio until the 1820s. So that sets the stage. But imagine, if you could, that this is the American West.
So when you said
Right.
moving westward, and I'm thinking,
Yeah.
wow, Ohio was west for them.
This was the wilderness. It was inhabited by Native Americans and hunters and trappers for the most part. There were some early settlements along the Ohio River in the 1780s and 1790s, but then this is all part of the Northwest Ordinance, which set aside and set up what are now the Great Lakes states as part of the United States. And then after some wars and treaties with the Native Americans who were already here, then it was opened up for westward expansion and settlement. And because we're so close to the state of Pennsylvania, we were really one of the gateways to the American West. And
Opening it all up.
Right, exactly.
Wow. And again, thinking that we were west with the entire United States out there. I wonder had anybody at that particular point, I wonder how far west was west for them? How far had they gone?
Well, I don't think Americans understood the full context or breadth of this continent until Lewis and Clark went all the way to the Pacific between 1805 and 1808. So basically in the colonies and the states, their concept of the West was infinite. They
just went
couldn't
on
see
and
any
on.
end to it.
Yeah, there was no ocean over there. It was just
Right.
all, just
Yes.
kind of went.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so Youngstown Township, that's something else to understand here. In the land that Connecticut claimed, they surveyed everything from approximately Western Reserve Road up to Lake Erie. And they laid it out in 5-mile square townships. And so if you look at all the townships in northern Mahoning County, Trumbull County, all the way across really to Sandusky Bay, everything is divided up in these neat little 5-mile squares. And that was the way that Connecticut did it. And of course, Virginia was responsible for surveying most of the rest of the state of Ohio, and they used 6-mile square townships. But that's something that's going to have meaning later on. But Youngstown was among the first townships to be settled by the Connecticut Land Company, who bought the eastern half of the Connecticut Western Reserve from the state in 1796, and then they opened it up for settlement. And it's named for John Young, who was the original purchaser of all this land in what's the core of the city of Youngstown, about 15,560 acres.
So right prior to that, was there a direct line of where Pennsylvania ended? I mean,
Yes.
that state was established, and then everything from that point on was considered the West and going to be the new territory of
Yes.
Ohio then.
Yeah, so the boundary for Pennsylvania was well established, and all of the early surveys really started on that line, which was a longitudinal line, and then they moved westward and northward from this corner of the Connecticut Western Reserve from the boundary with Pennsylvania. And there's still a marker out on State Line Road in extreme eastern Poland Township that speaks to that early settlement, and it's not at the location of that corner marker, but it's close by.
Is that the Town 1, Range 1? That's
Yes.
it there?
Well, that
I always wondered what that meant. Now I know.
Poland Township was Town 1, Range 1 of the Connecticut Western Reserve. So
Wow.
everything went from there.
From that exact point, and then it went on from there. So John Young, how did he come about to get the means to purchase this area?
Well, he was a farmer in New York. He had married into a family that founded Whitestown, which is now called Whitesboro, New York, which is in the central part of upstate New York. And he wasn't much for farming, and so he saw land speculation as a way to create a fortune for himself.
The first real estate agent, huh?
Among the early ones, yes. And so he found out that the Connecticut Land Company was selling 4 townships. This was in 1796 to fund their future development of the Western Reserve. And he came out here in the summer of 1796, found the area which would be his township, which is Town 2 of Range 2, so it's a perfect diagonal from Poland Township. And he inspected all the area and decided he wanted to buy this land. And so he went back and he bought what became Youngstown Township in February of 1797, and then that summer came back and started creating a settlement here.
Any idea of what he paid for that?
About $16,000.
Wow.
So a little over $1 an acre, and of course he was selling land for $2 an acre and upwards, depending on its location. So that's an immediate 100% turnover.
$16,000 was a lot of money back then, wasn't it?
It sure was. So he had to be financed because he was helping to finance the Connecticut Land Company's operations too by buying this township. So yeah, it was done a lot on credit. And also the Connecticut Land Company didn't have everything in order yet, so they weren't issuing official deeds. So he was selling land purely on speculation.
Wow. So he was kind of like the first real estate agent / car salesman in the area.
You could say that, yes. And it
Used car salesman.
Got him into a little bit of trouble with one of his customers named Daniel Sheehy, which is a name known around here.
Yeah, there's a street up on the south side, isn't there?
East side, yes.
East side, okay.
And he bought 1,000 acres of land with $2,000 in gold. So he was a sought-after customer. But unfortunately, because Young didn't have deeds or didn't keep track of the land he was selling, he sold off the southern portion of Sheehy's land, which was on the south bank of the Mahoning River, to James Gibson. So double sold the land, basically.
Twice.
Right. And when Sheehy found out about it, he was none too pleased, and from what we understand, he either physically assaulted Young or threatened his life, which then threw Daniel Sheehy into jail.
Well, they still did dueling back there, didn't they? He could have did the old smack in the face and met him on Market Street or Federal Street.
That was very unofficial, but that happened from time to time. But in this case, it didn't get to that, but there was a dispute, and Daniel Sheehy ended up losing that dispute. He had to travel back and forth from Connecticut twice to uphold his claim to the land, and finally the land company settled and said, this is yours and this is Mr. Gibson's. And so it was a
really
tense time.
As we're talking here, everybody out in the audience, you really have to picture this as nothing but trees and rivers and streams, and that's it. There wasn't a house, there wasn't a structure, there was nothing here except the woods.
Flora and fauna, yes.
That's it.
And
so the vision of these people in the Connecticut Land Company, and even Mr. Young, think of that vision, taking nothing into something.
Well, that's really part of the American DNA is looking for new opportunities, and throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, expanding the territory. And it started very early in American history with the Northwest Territory and Ohio and Northeastern Ohio in particular.
So just to reinforce this a little bit, in the great state of Ohio in which we live, we were the first in this area to start this whole great state off.
Among the first, yes.
Among the first. So were there other settlements south? Or?
Moses Cleveland. You might
Oh.
recognize that name.
With an A.
Yes. And at the same time that Young was exploring his township before he bought it, Cleveland led a surveying party along the lake shore and landed at the Cuyahoga River and surveyed that land, and eventually he bought it and started the city of Cleveland.
Wow.
Or what was then probably called Cleveland Township, because there were no incorporated villages or cities at that time.
Okay, so Mr. Young buys his little Youngstown Township. Where does it go from there?
Well, politically, Ohio wasn't a state until 1803, so it was considered, first of all, it was considered part of the Northwest Territory, and then it was set aside as the Ohio Territory. We had a territorial governor, Arthur St. Clair, and so this is very early in the 19th century, right after John Young came here and started his settlement in Youngstown Township, and people had to do their own thing. I mean, they had to elect their own form of government. They had to appoint people to be the tax collector, the prosecutor, the constable, somebody in charge of roads and improvements.
This was township by township by township.
Yes,
that had to be done too.
Every township had to establish its own way of governing itself within the statutes of the state of Connecticut and the United States at that time. But so one of the first things that St. Clair did was declare all the land that Connecticut Land Company had bought from the state of Connecticut to be a county, which was called Trumbull County, which was in honor of the governor of Connecticut, Jonathan Trumbull. And so everything east of the Cuyahoga River really was Trumbull County to begin with. And so
that's a pretty big area then.
It is. And so 1800, 1801, you need a place for county government to function. Youngstown and Warren were established within a year of each other, and they both wanted to be the seat of government for Trumbull County, and Warren won that one. And so county government started for Trumbull County in Warren about 1800, and the people of Youngstown were upset about that for the next 50 years.
Wow, I never knew that Youngstown was actually Trumbull County at one time. Look
Everything
at the things that you are going to learn today, folks. This is amazing.
Yeah, everything down to the southern boundary of Connecticut Western Reserve, which is called Western Reserve Road, was Trumbull County. And then throughout the early 19th century, other counties were developed within that area that was all of northeast Ohio, Ashtabula, Geauga, Portage, names that we know today. And Mahoning County really came later than all of that. In fact, Youngstown, for years, there was always a political rivalry between Youngstown and Warren, which goes back to this initial county seat fight that they had. And for years, the people here in Youngstown tried to maneuver to get Trumbull County's seat moved to Youngstown from Warren. And then when that didn't work, they thought, well, why don't we just start our own county, and we can head that one up.
Would they have had to secede from Trumbull County then, or?
Well, it wasn't so violent or disruptive. In order to form a new county, that had to be approved by an act of the Ohio legislature. And so in order to do that, you needed backing from your local representatives. In the Ohio House and Senate, they had to back that and actually propose it to the legislature to create a new county out of parts of an existing county. And that was a bit of a problem for Youngstown, because Trumbull County was still a pretty vast area, and so the representatives that we had in the Ohio legislature in the early 19th century didn't necessarily agree with Youngstown's position, so a lot of times the pleas of the people here in Youngstown didn't go anywhere. And in fact, it was an unpopular notion until 1845, when people in the village of Canfield, village and township of Canfield, which is southwest of Youngstown, had a new proposal in terms of taking 10 townships from Trumbull County and 5 townships from Columbiana County to the south, and creating a new county in which Canfield would be the seat of government.
The county seat.
And that actually, in early 1846, the local representatives went along with that, proposed it to the state legislature, and in February of 1846, they passed the act which created Mahoning County out of those 15 townships. And it went into existence on March 1st, 1846.
And Canfield was the county seat.
Canfield was the seat of government, and of course, the people in Youngstown were furious about that.
So just take one step backwards for my own edification here. When was Ohio all the way around? Were complete as we see it today?
Ohio entered the Union as a state in 1803, March 1st, 1803.
And surveyed all the way to the Indiana line and all the way down as we know it today then?
Right.
Okay.
Now there were disputes about various tracts of land within the state, like the Connecticut Western Reserve, that weren't settled immediately, but as far as the state is concerned, it started March 1st, 1803.
Wow. Okay. So then that's how the legislators were there to help try to figure out this Trumbull-Mahoning thing.
Right. So after 1803, you had a state governor, you had a state House and Senate to deal with such issues throughout the state of Ohio. And there were a lot of other counties formed from the initial ones that would have been there in 1803. I mean, we're just talking about a dozen or so counties, and now we have 88 in the state of Ohio. So it wasn't uncommon. There were other political fights, but here in the Mahoning Valley, it's legendary what we had between Youngstown and Warren.
A little bit of a turf war there.
Right. And then after 1806, for the next 30 years, you had a political struggle between Youngstown and Canfield for the seat of government.
So we finally got away from Trumbull County, and now we got to fight with Canfield to bring it here to Youngstown.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting to know, why is that so important in that time period? And what we have to consider is the fact that seat of government meant the courts were there, the county commissioners were there, the county treasurer, auditor, all those offices were in the courthouse or in buildings around the courthouse. In 1848, when they built the courthouse in Canfield, that was the case. So people couldn't get online at that time and pay their taxes, couldn't send their tax bill in by mail, didn't have attorneys and whatnot who would file their land sales and record the deeds and all that. People had to come to the courthouse and do that in person. Now, in that time period, that involved probably a couple of days by the time you packed your horse or wagon and came in, and then you had to put your horse into a livery, and you took care of your county business, and while you're there you might buy provisions for your farm. You want to have some place to eat, you might want to stay overnight and do several things while you were in Canfield or any other county seat. So it was an economic engine as well as a political prestige thing for a community to have the seat of government in it. And so that was the prize that Youngstown was looking for, the prestige and the potential for economic development. And that continued all through the 19th century until about 1873, when people in Youngstown got organized and they called a county seat removal convention in Youngstown. And the people who attended this meeting agreed that they wanted to push for election in October 1873, local representatives in the Ohio legislature who would be sympathetic to Youngstown's cause to have the seat of government moved to Youngstown. And they were well organized. They had a lot of money from Youngstown because it was an emerging industrial center now. So there's a lot of money being made in what was then the city of Youngstown, and so they had more economic power and influence to do something about it. Now, in August of 1873, folks in Canfield had an anti-removal convention, and basically they swore and committed to stopping this process from Youngstown, and so they had their
Sure,
own slate of representatives
like
up
you
for
said,
election.
the livery was there,
Right.
the provisions, the stores were there, so they had their little economy built upon people coming to the courthouse.
Right, that's absolutely right. And they knew Youngstown at that time was a city of over 10,000 people. It had economic influence, but taking county government away from Canfield would be detrimental. They knew that, and they fought tooth and nail all through the 1870s to prevent that. Now, in the election of 1873, the pro-removal candidates won. And when they got in the legislature in early 1874, they immediately moved toward a measure to move county government from Canfield to Youngstown. It went through the legislature and was passed from the standpoint that it would require a vote of the people throughout the county to actually decide that issue. And so in October of 1874, you had the vote on the removal issue, and because the majority of the people already lived in Youngstown from Mahoning County, it won easily.
Let's say, what was the population in Canfield at that point?
Probably 2,000-3,000 people.
Versus at least 10
10,000
and
here.
growing here.
Right, and then if you look at all of the county, which was still very rural, the population numbers were very much in Youngstown's favor.
So the settlements really were Youngstown and Canfield. What else was, Poland was there at that time?
Poland was another small village, which is southeasternmost part of Mahoning County, and really those were the three primary incorporated areas in the county. Everything else was just townships and very rural, very, very small town, and so this was really a struggle between the two primary municipal areas, Youngstown and Canfield.
Really, I think we take for granted all the technology and everything that we have at our disposal today, but think of it back then, trying to get the word out of what was going on in a vast area of all those people. That how did they get the notifications? I'm sure there was a newspaper back then.
There were newspapers, but they were weekly. There was mail, but governments really didn't have the money to be sending tax notices and everything out. So you had to know when your taxes were due, or when anything that was time sensitive. It was up to you to know when to pay that.
Or the tax collector would come and pay you a visit at some point.
Well, that could happen too, which you didn't want to see them at your house necessarily.
Right. Well, but how different, my gosh, how different it was back then compared to even
very much so.
50 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now the county seat is finally moving to where it still remains today in Youngstown.
Not yet.
Not yet?
No.
Okay.
After the election in October of 1874, people in Canfield immediately filed suit in the courts to basically set aside that vote, saying that it was unconstitutional that when Mahoning County was formed in 1846, it set Canfield as the permanent seat of government, and that could not be changed. So that was their argument. That case made it through the lower courts, and every court along the way sided with the removal vote, which was to move it to Youngstown. And even before it went to the state Supreme Court, which it did in 1876, people in Youngstown in all this process also had to build a courthouse and offices and everything you need to run government in Youngstown, and had to use private money to do that. So in the summer of 1874, the local backers here in Youngstown raised the required $100,000 to build all those structures and provide the facilities for county government. And even then, they didn't think that was enough, so they went out and got another $100,000. So they had $200,000 in subscriptions to pay to make sure that county government came to Youngstown. And so they met all their obligations. They built a new courthouse in downtown Youngstown at the corner of Wick Avenue and Wood Street. And then in the summer of 1876, there was a train of horse-drawn wagons that went from Youngstown to Canfield, went to the courthouse, saw the county commissioners, gave them the deed to their new courthouse in Youngstown, and they began loading up all the records and office furniture to move it back to Youngstown.
Wow. And they didn't put up a fight, they just let it go?
Well, this very interesting legend grew out of this period, and some people still say it today that people in Youngstown came in the middle of the night and broke into the courthouse in Canfield and took everything out and snuck out before the people in Canfield were aware that was happening. So they thought it was nefarious and it was a dirty deal like that, but it's a legend, it's a myth. It was very legitimate and happened during the day.
But at that time, they had every right to do it because it was set, they won the election, and it was set to come here. They just had to build the facility to do it then.
Pending the appeals that happened in the courts, the vote had already decided it, and the lower courts had upheld the vote. The case went to the Ohio Supreme Court in the fall of 1876. Once again, they upheld it. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1879.
They weren't letting it go,
They would not let it go, and the Supreme Court upheld every other court ruling on it, and that was the end of it right there.
They finally had to succumb to that.
Right.
They lost.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting story, and in some ways it kind of explains the way some people still think between city and rural areas of Mahoning County, eastern part versus western part, because it's long-standing political battle here in this region.
Wow, even today, there's always been, I used to call it the Mason-Dixon line of Mahoning and Trumbull County. So now I know why that is the way it was. It probably goes all the way back to then. It's just the people from Trumbull County do not want to think of themselves or think of Mahoning County people, and vice versa. It's always been that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because despite the political rivalry, there were still very strong friendships and business connections between people in Youngstown and people in Warren. It was necessary in those early days because there were so few people here, there were so few people that had money or particular skills to build communities, so there had to be interaction between Youngstown and Warren as the two primary communities here in what's now Trumbull and Mahoning County, or the Mahoning Valley as a whole. And despite the political rivalry, they still had those connections. And it's also interesting, when our organization was founded, the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, in 1875, it's a regional organization. It's a regional historical society, and our mission was focused on the Mahoning River watershed on the lower part of the river, which starts up northwest of Warren and Leavittsburg and then comes all the way through Trumbull and Mahoning counties to the state line. So our organization even had that regional look to it and regional focus, whereas other people, as you say, that Mason-Dixon line, they don't see anything of value going on either side of it.
And that was drawn, but I guess we are, and it's kind of funny how things come full circle. It seems that at some point in the future, we might be a region again as we move to one big united area, maybe.
Well, I have news for you. We already are a region to everybody else in the world.
Just the people here
We're a statistical
recognize
area,
it, though.
yes, but we need to recognize that too.
Yeah, at some point it'll get to we are the Mahoning Valley instead of being parochial as to each little village, township, or city that we live in. And it's better for us too, I think, economically, if we would finally give in to that.
Well, I think we have to recognize the individual identities we've built here and all the place names, the townships, the villages, the cities, all the ethnic diversity we have here. That I don't think we need to lose that so much, but on some levels we do need to look at ourselves as a region. So what happens in Bezetta is important to everybody else. What happens in Austintown is important to the rest of the region. What happens in Youngstown is very important to the rest of the region. What happens in Warren is important to the whole region. And so we have to have our quilt, so to speak, of diversity, but we also have, in order to compete economically and politically, we have to come together on another plane and speak as a whole region.
Speaking of nationalities, back back then when Trumbull County had the majority, what were the nationalities of the people here?
Well, the earliest settlers were primarily from the American colonies. I'd say most of them were born here in North America either before or after the Revolution. The earliest immigrants would have been coming from Ireland, Wales, Scotland, which again is part of the British Empire at that point. And then when we got into the 19th century, 1820s, 1830s, you start to see a German migration coming over from Europe and then making its way into places like Youngstown and Warren. And then in the 1830s, again, more from Great Britain, Welsh coal miners, Scottish coal miners, iron makers, Irish farmers and laborers coming here, and a big migration from Ireland in the 1840s during the Great Famine, which affected the United States all across, especially on the East Coast, but also here in the Mahoning Valley as well. And then after the Civil War, the migration patterns became more diverse and over a bigger part of Europe because of the instability that was going on there economically, but also politically, with the empires frequently at war with each other and leading up to the big war, which was World War I. So from Germany, from the eastern areas, Slovaks,
Czechoslovakia,
Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Hungarians, the Balkans down there, Serbs, Croatians, just thousands of people, part of the millions that were coming here from all over Europe and the Mediterranean area.
Wow. And a lot of them decided to come here because of what we were about to turn into industrially.
Well, we were already there.
Yeah, with the steel mills.
Yeah.
And
the demand for labor increased in the 1860s and 1870s. Youngstown and Mahoning Valley was recognized throughout the country as a leading center of iron manufacturing. There was a point in the 1880s when the city of Youngstown had the highest per capita income in the nation.
wow, that's a very interesting fact.
It is. It doesn't mean everybody was well off. It
Right.
means there were a lot.
Well, there were a lot less people than there were
lot less people,
later.
but there was a handful that were making a whole lot of money
lot.
in iron production. And gradually that grew. In the 1890s, steel production really took over as a metal of choice because it was stronger but also more flexible. And then in the late 1890s, throughout the early 20th century, steel production just exploded across the Mahoning Valley.
My grandparents on both sides came over right around the turn of the century in 1890 to 1900.
Right.
And that's when they settled here. And you often wonder what they had to have over there in order to take that chance to get on that boat and to come over here and to take that risk. I knew they had some people that that had already settled here that they could take up and live with until they got established. But that took some guts to do something like that. But think of us doing that today.
Well, you bring that up, and it's the same spirit that began to settle this region in the late 18th and 19th century.
Exactly.
There's better opportunities over there. Let's take a chance and go meet those opportunities.
But it wasn't something like you're gonna, drive to Pittsburgh and hop on an airplane and be there in 5.5 hours or 8 hours or whatever the flight would be.
Yeah.
It took
2 to 3 weeks.
Yeah, weeks to get here.
To get from the East Coast to Ohio in the early 19th century.
And I'm sure there had to be some joggling of finding paperwork over there to get out of that country to come over here.
Well, yeah, I mean, most people, if they were in the imperial parts of Europe, they had papers. And the governments were not at all concerned about them leaving because there's
the door.
We have other people to oppress. Thank
That's
you very
right,
much.
that's right.
And so
10 more after you.
Yeah.
See you later.
And so there was no concern about that. And immigration policy here was very open, even though there was a lot of pressure in the 19th century to constrict and to halt the mass immigration that was happening here because people were worried about are these real Americans, or what are they going to do to
Are
what we
they
understand
right.
as America, or being culturally American?
And knowing what they're coming from and the government types that they had back then too.
Oh, they were worried about organized crime, the Black Hand. They were worried about anarchists and communists and socialists. All of these things were brewing over in Europe, and bringing that here and having an adverse effect on American society, very much.
I found it really interesting. I took my daughter to Boston. I'm a big Boston Red Sox fan and had never been there, and Fenway was on my bucket list. And we went there, and when you talk about history, there's not really too many places like Boston that you can go to without just being immersed wherever you look. You know, Benjamin Franklin, you know, read the Declaration over here, and his grandparents are buried over there, and it's just an amazing town. But one of the things that I found fascinating was we went into a bar that was like 180 years old, and they had this little sign in the front window, and it said Nina. And then I had noticed that in a couple other places, and I walked inside and I said, what's this Nina thing? And he goes, we have that there just as a historical significant factor. And I said, well, what might that be? And it said, Nina stands for No Irish Need Apply. And I said, what are you talking about? You know, when I think of Boston, I think that's a big Irish, you know, territory there. You know, and he said, no, when the Irish came over here, we didn't want anything to do with them. They said when they would come for jobs, you know, we put the sign there. We don't want you here. Right. Go away. No Irish need apply.
That
so
was Boston
even
of 1850.
Right. Even back then, you had those type of situations with the.
Oh, certainly.
And again, I was really amazed at the fact that I was astounded because, my gosh, it's the Boston Celtics. It's this is an Irish town. When you think of Boston, you just think of red-headed people running around, all Irish everywhere, but no, they weren't welcome there.
It took a few generations of assimilation and just control by the sheer number of Irish to take over politically to create the Boston that we know today. But you raise an interesting point. I mean, here's a community in Massachusetts which has a 180-year head start on us here in Ohio, and so. But still, there's an evolution. There's the pioneer period, there's the wilderness period, and then there's the industrial age. So some things mirror each other, but others we just can't go that far back.
I could even remember it. You know, I'm Slovak and Ukrainian Polish, however you want to call it. The Polish-Ukraine border switched all the time. So my grandparents said they were Ukrainian, but on my mom's birth certificate, it said that they were from Poland. But actually it just happened to be that week it was Poland, and the next week it was probably Ukraine, but they all considered themselves to be of Ukrainian heritage.
Right.
And I could remember them telling us that a lot of people didn't welcome them, you know, when they were here. They happened to be potato farmers when they were back there, and they were, you know, the word we use is, you know, we call ourselves hunkies, but at one time that was not a very, very welcome term. It was a derogatory term towards those people. So not everybody that came to America with the ideals of grandeur, you know, they did some suffering too. They had to fight their way and be recognized and be accepted and fight their way to get the jobs and work their way into it. And I think back on that with them and all the other races and nationalities and think of what they went through at the beginnings and how good we don't have to do that now. So
no, but there are still people on the move, and this is a universal human condition.
Yes, and it keeps going. Fortunately, it's getting better and better in that way. Okay, so we digress there, but this is very interesting to me. So we've got Youngstown now as the county seat, and Canfield over there and Poland over here and a couple other townships. So how did Mahoning County then really all meld together?
Well, it took some doing. It's like I mentioned before, if you look at a map of Mahoning County, there's this little leg that sticks out in the southwest corner, and that's because of that line, which is now Western Reserve Road, where you had the 5-mile square townships to the north and the 6-mile square townships to the south. So, Springfield, Beaver, Greene, Goshen, and Smith townships were part of Columbiana County, were originally surveyed by Virginians. So a little different there.
At 6 miles.
At 6 miles,
Okay.
yes. So I think the common issues that we had after 1846 with the formation of Mahoning County and also after 1876 when government moved to Youngstown was you had a very industrialized northeast portion of Mahoning County and a very agrarian and rural rest of the county. The west and the southern parts were still to this day in many ways involved with farming and agriculture and some industries that support that. So that really was very strongly noticed throughout the development of the city of Youngstown and then the incorporation of East Youngstown, which became the city of Camel, the incorporation of the city of Struthers. These were all industrial centers here in Mahoning County. And so one could say that the political influence was in the northeastern part of the county because that's where all the money was and the vast majority of the population, that the resources went more to that part of the county because it was urbanizing and developing, though we still needed roads and bridges and other improvements throughout the rest of the county. But something started to happen in the 1920s and 1930s, which then really was halted by the Great Depression and World War II, and that was people starting to get crowded, feeling and not liking life in the city and looking to the rest of the county, the rural areas, to establish homes, and through improved transportation they could actually get in and out of the city to work but live out in the country. And so this is the great suburban migration that started slowly in the 1920s and 30s, and then after World War II just
I didn't know it happened
expanded.
that early. I thought more of that was like in the 50s and 60s. I didn't know it was that early.
No, you have residential subdivisions in Coatesville and Boardman and Austintown and Liberty, and to a lesser extent in Poland Township and elsewhere in the teens and 20s, where land was sold to developers. It was broken up into smaller lots, and roads were run out, streetcar lines, water lines, sewer lines to start all these things. And but it didn't really take off until after World War II, because you just had that pent-up demand between not having the funds and the Great Depression and not having the resources during the war to make that happen. And
But
really,
still, the demand for all this to happen was there.
Yeah.
It couldn't happen because of the economic situation of the day.
And part of it really was understandable, because Youngstown's peak population was in 1930, 170,000 people.
Wow.
And it possibly went higher than that throughout the 1930s, but in between census.
Now, is that with the same city lines as it is today?
Yes.
Okay.
The exact
Struthers
same
and
lines.
Coatesville and all that was
Right.
on their own at that point.
But you have to keep in mind that the outer neighborhoods of the city weren't developed yet. Kirkmere on the southwest side, the Brownlee Woods, the upper north side, out in the Lincoln Knolls area, those were still farms.
and therein
basically.
lies all the congestion then.
So you had this intense congestion, housing shortages in the city, and so people were looking for room and better housing, and so it wasn't until after the war that developers could realize that and make that happen, and people had the money at that point because of what they had saved throughout the war and through unionization and increases in wages and salaries in the steel industry and other related industries. It was a very prosperous time here in Mahoning County.
And hopefully we'll get back to that at some point. There was a lot of names. A lot of times, people say, "Oh, well, I've got to go up Hillman and to get to this street here, or whatever." And people don't realize that those streets are not just named for
No.
something. Those are actual people. Andrews, Avenue, Hillman, a lot of founding fathers, so to speak, in industry. Just throw out a few of them so people know.
Well, Hillman Street is named for James Hillman, who, from every indication, met John Young when he first arrived here in 1796, and he actually acted as a guide, since he knew this area, to tell them what they might find in this township. And John Young was so grateful for that he offered 6 acres of land to James Hillman and his wife, Catherine, to move here. They lived down in Beavertown, which is now Beaver, Pennsylvania, on the Ohio River. And so they came here 1797, were among the earliest settlers, and he was a key player in the development of early Youngstown. Daniel Sheehy, who I mentioned before, wanted to buy land out here, and he did, and after everything died down with the dispute that he had with John Young, he settled in on his farm property in what's now the east side of Youngstown, and of course we have Sheehy Street, which is named for him, which runs through part of that historic property. Rayen Avenue, Rayen High School, the Rayen School. William Rayen was another early settler. He came here about 1801, 1802. He established an early tavern and general store attached to his house, which is just across the street and over a little bit from the Tyler History Center here in downtown Youngstown. Actually, the #1 fire station here in Youngstown was on Rayen's property, or is on his former property, so that's where he lived. And so he was involved in the political and civic leadership, and also during the War of 1812, he was commissioned the colonel for the local militia and carried that moniker around, as well as being called Judge Rayen because he was a justice of the peace.
It was his legacy is still around today. Is it a foundation that he has for schools? I know he's very, very big with education.
He died in 1854, and his estate, he left a large sum of money to the village of Youngstown and Youngstown Township to establish a central school which would be open to all people. So there was no discrimination as far as who could attend this school. And so with the money from the Rayen estate, they formed an early school board which built the first Rayen School, which still stands on Wick Avenue. It's now part of the Youngstown Board of Education offices and houses Rayen Early College. And that opened in 1866 as Youngstown's first centralized school, and then it became the city's first high school, so the school of the higher grades, which not a lot of students did in those days. If you got to 8th grade in the 19th century, you were doing pretty well. But to go through to high school, that would be the equivalent today of having a college degree. And so they built the school, and the money that they had left from his estate, they created the Rayen Foundation, which since it started has been providing funding, first of all, to the Rayen School and Rayen High School, but now since there's no longer a Rayen School, it supports the school district in general. I
know it helped out the refurbishing of Cheney, and when they made it into a STEM school, and thank God there was somebody as good as him that did something that, and his legacy is still going on with that, so that's great for our area. But there's not the only, there's the Andrews and the other industrialists.
19th century industrialists. You have Brownlee Woods, which is a neighborhood in the southeast side of town, named for the Brownlee family, who were early settlers, which then was even part of Boardman Township. It was later annexed into the city of Youngstown. A lot of place names on the east side.
McGuffey for the McGuffey Reader.
William Holmes McGuffey grew up in Coatesville Township, next to Youngstown. His first mentor was the Reverend William Wick. There's a big Youngstown name, and he went on to great fame with education, being president of Miami University here in Ohio, and then of course his famous McGuffey Eclectic Readers, which were used in schools across the country.
Quite the history we have here.
We sure do.
I want to thank you for helping to enlighten some of the audience today. And You don't have to just stop here. He's given us kind of a dose of what you could learn here. And there's a couple museums that you're a part of, and I want you to talk a little bit about them and why you and your family should come out and visit them. They're amazing if you have not been to them. The Tyler where we're sitting, the Arms. The Historical Society has done amazing things with these places, and it's all part of our past that we all should really take a part of and enjoy. So I'm going to go ahead, Bill, and tell us a little bit about them.
Well, Mahoning Valley Historical Society, as I said, was founded in 1875, and we were a loose organization, so to speak, until 1961, when we had our first, shall we say, quantum leap, and Olive F.A. Arms, who owned a residence property on historic Wick Avenue. When she passed away, she gave that property and endowment funds to the Historical Society to establish our first local history museum, which is called the Arms Museum, but now we call it the Arms Family Museum to help people know that it's not about guns and weapons. Right. And so we've been open there since 1964. It's a wonderful place to visit in terms of a historic house, which we preserve and interpret on the first floor, but then we have exhibits on the second floor and ground floor about our great decorative arts collection that we've put together over 145 years from the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, and these would be household items, furniture, textiles, quilts, coverlets, clothing, metalware, paintings, local artists, and all the things that would decorate a home. This is the kinds of things you would see now at the Arms Family Museum. So it helps you to better understand how people actually lived in their homes at various times and some of the interesting and beautiful things that they had in their homes throughout our history. And
you do a wonderful job during the holidays with that, turning that over. And
Memories of Christmas Past is coming
soon. Up. It's a great time. And again, you going to visit these places helps to perpetuate them too. So your donation of entrance there keeps the Historical Society, of which we can never let go of our past. That's something that we never ever want to happen. No. And at Tyler, you just established this here, and this is a wonderful, wonderful place to come and visit.
This is relatively new. The Historical Society purchased this building in 2007. We started a campaign in 2008 to raise the money to do the transformation that we see now, which is the Tyler Mahoning Valley History Center. It's a $4.5 million investment in downtown Youngstown, but it's a very important one because what we have here is a community center, and that's why it's a history center, not a history museum, because it's not just about coming to learn about things, which obviously is a big part of our mission here. We have our Historical Society archives in the basement. We have these wonderful exhibits on the first floor. We have an education center on the third floor, but we also have a historic ballroom, which we restored as part of the renovation of this building. And it's a great space to have family and community and public events.
Is there anything else they could do to learn about our great area?
Well,
online?
You can visit Mahoning Valley Historical Society online. It's mahoninghistory.org. And there's a lot of information about our sites, our archives collections, the business media archives, which is now up at the Arms Family Museum campus, and upcoming events, things that you can do here. Our hours are there, our admission prices, anything you need to know about the Historical Society. And there's a lot of other history here in Mahoning County and throughout the Mahoning Valley, and so I would tell people to check that out too, with our village and township historical societies and other historic sites throughout Mahoning and Trumbull County.
All right. And in months to come, we're going to be visiting with people that helped to establish Austintown and Poland and Canfield and Boardman and other little townships like Bill has told us about through Mahoning County. We're going to learn about their past. We're going to learn about what's going on right now and what their vision is for the future. And we're going to continue on with it, and that's what Locally Speaking is all about. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I certainly did. I thought it was fascinating, and I'm going to continue to come to these museums so I could learn even more about where my grandparents, thankfully, came here and settled back around 1900. Because, man, oh man, I'd be in Slovakia or the Ukraine today if they didn't. So thank you very much for tuning in. Tell all your friends about Locally Speaking. Go to Facebook, watch it again, and you have a great month. We're going to be back next month with Township Trustee Jim Davis from Austintown, and he's going to give us a little bit about what's going on there now and what's going on in the future. And we're probably going to have somebody also come in and talk a little bit about the past. So thank you once again. You have a great rest of the month, and we'll see you again real soon on Locally Speaking.